Hello and welcome to another episode of Fired Up. I am joined today by Nicole Pytel. Hey, Nicole.
Hey, Morgan. Hey, everyone.
And by Ian Lipner.
Hey, Morgan. Hey, Nicole.
Today we're going to be talking about writing. And I always say that everyone could write, but only a few people can write. So this is definitely a skill, but it's a skill that everybody needs to a certain extent in their careers. So how do we improve our writing? It's a constant thing for us to keep improving. So I thought we would go around the table and sort of swap some notes and talk about how we approach copywriting, because it's a fundamental thing for a content marketing agency and a PR agency to be able to do it. Let's just sort of dive in. I want to talk about concept. I want to talk about research. I want to talk about techniques. I want to talk about AI, editing, and some tips to avoid and some tips that sort of help make you better. So let's just start with the process. Say we've got a blog post to write. That's a very typical deliverable. We've got a topic. We might know something about it, but maybe not enough. Where do we start, Nicole?
Yeah, great question, because there's so many things that you could do. What I do, and this probably goes back to my days as a journalist when we had to pitch stories, was the first thing that I do is come up with a hook in one sentence. What is this post going to be about, and why would somebody care to read it? So I'll give you an example. For one of our fintech clients, we did a blog post on fraud detection. There's a million different ways you could go with that. So the hook was, there's a ton of misconceptions about fraud that are costing banks money, and here's how you avoid them. Simple sentence, declarative sentence, tells you exactly what's going to happen, makes it easier to pitch the idea to the client as well, and also keeps you focused as you're writing. So that's where I always start.
Not me. That sounds wonderful. And I've tried that way. I've tried to outline but I'm sort of let's just get some ideas on the paper. Let's get some phrases that work. Let's get the emotion right. Let's understand what's this person or what's this organization's voice. And then let's go and put some words down that seem to kind of get that idea across, either with a little bit of a twist because I heard something in a conversation with the folks that I'm working with, or that challenges an existing notion in the industry. Or again, we're not talking about something specific, but if I'm thinking about that piece that Nicole's making, I'm trying to come up with those points that are going to be most sort of arresting and keep people reading, right? And so I kind of create sort of a compendium of these things. And then I start to go, okay, which ones are most important and useful? And then maybe I start thinking about my draft.
Right. So think about the audience first and the goal of what you want to sort of say. And then it sounds like you both sort of, Nicole, you called it a hook, and Ian, you sort of like some phrases and words and angles that might be atypical and interesting, but really sort of come down with that sort of concept. And I do think it's really important to have that right up front. Like, what do we actually want to say here? And when it goes wrong, you can feel it where people are just sort of starting and they're sort of trying to work out in the post what they want to say. And I'll know it once I've written it, then it meanders. But if you start with the audience and those hooks or those sort of different phrases, even, Ian, you got to have that down and clear at the beginning so you can kind of feel motivated to kind of, I'm onto something here and it's worth my effort. And it's worth the reader's effort.
Yeah, it's like a connect the dots in the way I kind of create it, right? Like, it's like, now I'm starting to see a shape here. And, if I just arrange this properly here, now this starts to feel like I'm getting across the idea without just sort of popping all over the place or going on and on.
If you don't stay focused, you're going to go down a rabbit hole. You're going to ramble. And when somebody reads what you've written, they're going to know that you had no idea what you were trying to accomplish when you started. Like, it will be crystal clear that you're just down a rabbit hole and rambling.
It's great if you know in your head enough content to sort of draft a post yourself. If you're doing it about a home topic where you have a lot of domain expertise, but that's rare. More typically, you're going to need to do some research to update stats and to sort of substantiate your argument. I think, Nicole, you're really good at this. How do you go about researching, and how do you know whether you've done enough research before you start writing?
Yeah, I think knowing if you've done enough is you feel comfortable to sit down and again, you have a clear direction. You're not rambling. You're not trying to put fluff in there. Like, you know exactly what you're trying to say and you feel comfortable with the facts to back it up. I think that's how you know when you're done. As far as getting there, there's two ways that we approach this. And one is desk research. I can go out and find credible sources to get things like statistics or like an overview of specific trends or what's going on in a particular industry. I can get the background. I can get some hard facts that way. And then 99 times out of 100, it's going to take a conversation with a subject matter expert. We build SME interviews into our workflows on just about everything because they know more than we do by design. They're product managers or they're CEOs, or they've helped develop this cool thing that we're writing about. And they're always going to know more than we do. And there's no shame in that. My mom always taught me, always listen to people who know more than you do. And it definitely applies here. Ask them a bunch of questions. Say, I need 30 minutes of your time. They're more than happy to give it because it's going to create a stronger piece in the end.
I feel with research too, you can look at what's already been said, right? I'm literally researching the title of my post to see what arguments people have made. Do I agree with them? Do I disagree with them? Can I build on that? Because I don't want to just churn out another post about this topic that people have seen before. No one's going to read that. You have to move the conversation forward. So in my research, when I'm doing something, always try and look at who's an authority on this and what have they said? And how do I pivot off that or build upon that? And I have to admit, often when it comes to research, if I'm writing and I don't have the substantiation points to hand, I'll just put a note in my post to say supporting fact and move on with my argument, because often you can find the data later that's more current. I find it in my flow when I'm writing about something, if I just need a third party proof point to kind of carry my argument, I'll add that later. You don't need all of that up front. What you do need is to understand what's been said and what's out there already so that you can move the conversation forward. That will make it more interesting. So we've done some research. We've got a pretty good idea of a hook or our argument and our target audience here. We're ready to put finger to keyboard. How do we start? Do we start with an outline? Do we just start with the first paragraph? Ian, where do you start?
Okay, yeah. So now you start with me, and I'm going to talk about like pretty much what would be not the way to teach it, maybe. So what you do is you start with a very large caffeinated beverage of some sort. That's the first thing that you need. When I'm writing, I really believe in symmetry. As I'm creating something, I have to imagine that if I'm going to make my point up front, for example, like in a press release, we'll talk about something that's pretty standard for us and isn't necessarily a creative fount of options, right? I'm going to make sure that I have a quote in mind to put at that end of that press release that's like capping the pen, sort of, that really reflects the lead. Like, I'm thinking about the quote while I'm writing that lead that shows what this story is, because I know that the people who I'm imagining I can keep interested, they may leave after the second paragraph and they'll still get the gist of the news, right? The people who I'm going to end up talking to, maybe working with or getting a placement out of, they're going to read all the way to the bottom and they're going to look for that sort of that symmetry that makes them feel like that story, top to bottom, was sort of follows that inverted pyramid that we always talk about. It's hard to keep a reader interested that way, right? That was invented so that they could snip, if it got snipped off on the little machine, you still got your lead in there and the news, the knowledge would be out, right? But it's really hard to interest people with that. And so it depends on the format you're writing. But I really think, to round out my answer, before I put my fingers to keyboard, I'm thinking about what's the shape of this how can I make it symmetrical? If it's going to have a big climactic part in the middle, then, I got to build properly and come down properly. I don't want it to fall off a cliff at the end and feel like, okay, this writer got tired of writing. Right? We all have that sense. So I really think about symmetry, and it's often like you're kind of writing as if you're writing in a mirror. You got to imagine, okay, you need to present some tension, right? Like in any story with a climax in the middle, like we started here and we had this problem, and then this thing got introduced, and now things are getting better. And this problem that I referenced before and what it would look like, that solution, that feeling that I would get, that I talked about yearning for at the beginning of the story, is now present at the end of the story. So I guess that's how I start is with the shape of the story in mind. And then I just use that caffeine to pound out copy.
That's actually the perfect way to teach somebody to do it. Yeah, absolutely. I wish I was that organized. My style actually varies. So in terms of an outline, we will do them when we're working on something long form for a client, because it gets everybody aligned right in the beginning. It's a lot easier to get alignment and get approval on an outline and go back and make changes and iterate on some bullet points than it is on an ebook or a giant video script or something like that. So when it comes to working with clients, if we're doing something long form, for sure, there's always an outline. If it's just me writing something, if I sit down to like hash out a blog post for Firebrand or even an article for a client, something like that, it kind of depends on how I start. I'm always going to start with that hook. I'm always going to start with my research. I'm always going to start with what emotions is this audience feeling? Does this topic save them from making a mistake? Does this topic give them information because they're terrified about something and this fixes that? Like, what's going on in the reader's head? And I kind of go with that. And sometimes I'll literally start in the middle, oddly enough. If I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to do a list of proof points, I may start with that and then write around it, which sounds really, really random. But I think the point is you got to do whatever feels right for that piece. And if you feel really stuck, like, hey, I can't think of an introduction, and oh my God, now I can't write this, and now I can't do anything, just start in the middle or start at the end. There's been times I've written the final paragraph before I've written anything else. So I think that's certainly probably not a way you should teach people to do this, but it's whatever works for you and whatever gets it out. So in the end, if you have a great piece, however you got there that works for you is perfect.
That's a good lesson. Everybody has a different style to do it, because I actually like to think about not the headline, but the first paragraph, like the framing of my article. Like, I want to get underway. And so I'll just sort of get that first paragraph done, and I'm feeling good about it. I've set up this piece, and then I'll literally stop and then just write out paragraph about this and mention some questions I want to answer. Like, I just did this post about how to announce funding. I frame it out. Okay, what is funding? And I sort of lead into it. And then I stopped and I thought, okay, what are the questions that I would have if I was wanting to understand this? And so I wrote all those out and a couple of other things that I made sure I wanted, and then just bang through them. And, you might stop and come back to it, right? Because it's hard to just sit there for hours typing away until you get into the flow. But I wanted to be able to go, okay, at least I know these are the things that are going to get covered, and you can kind of circle around to it a few times. So I think it sounds like we all have slightly different approaches to it, but whatever works for you is important. But you do need to have that argument and that structure up front. You're going to just sort of drift off, and the reader can kind of feel that.
Yeah, you mentioned sometimes you'll leave like a space for, okay, find the research that backs up this point. And I do that too. And I have found that sometimes, oh, wait, I made the wrong assumption there. And it can end up sort of, okay, let me take a step back and rethink about what the framing is. I see the framing as sort of like my hypothesis. And then the research kind of helps me decide on that. And oftentimes there'll be some sort of data point that comes up by accident while you're searching for the other that actually gives you an entirely new. And that's why Okay, so if we're teaching folks, right, we talk about outlining things. And I think for folks who are not sure how to approach it, starting with a framework and starting with a discipline and deciding how much of it you need to use, it's an important way to go about things. What you'll find, I think, as you write, is that there isn't a perfect framework for all content. I mean, Nicole mentioned long form content. I thought the things I was saying before I would never do in a huge, long ebook. I would definitely plan that out and think about that structure in advance. But I guess my point is, this is going to sound really cheesy, but it's sort of like jazz or something, right? Like you set out, you know the tune that you intend to play, but you don't know what's going to pop up exactly. And you have to be able to improvise with sort of the content that the research, the bits that you get.
Yeah. I like that analogy because, you'd sit down 2 different times to write the same post and they come out different each time, but both would be great. So one of the most terrifying things is that blank sheet of paper. Like it's sitting there in front of you. The little cursor is blinking. You've got to write something. You've got a half an hour. This thing needs to get done. How do you break that, Nicole?
So it's going to seem very counterintuitive, but that blank screen and that blinking cursor, it can be very intimidating, especially if you're hearing the clock ticking going along with it. Mm-hmm. What I do is I get up. I leave the screen. I leave the room. If I have time to go walk my dog Minnie, I'll do that. If I have time to go for a run, I'll do that. Some of my best ideas have been just running down the sidewalk and just this aha moment hits you. Or I'm walking down the street with Minnie, like having a conversation with her about this, like she has an opinion and it just comes to you. So if you have a minute, and it doesn't even have to be that long of a break, walk around your house, go down to the mailbox and come back, take a couple minutes to just get away from it. Because your brain is just churning and churning and churning. That's not helpful. What you need to do is just kind of relax and say, okay, we're going to get through this. It's going to be fine. I just have to figure it out and give it a couple minutes. And more often than not, something's going to come to you and you're going to have somewhere to start that piece.
Yeah. There's that classic image of the writer on the typewriter, and they type something and they think, oh, this is terrible. And they take it and they wrap it up and they throw it over their shoulder and they start over and they do that 50, 60 times. The great thing about a computer is you don't have to do that. You can just press, return a bunch of times. And if you keep typing, and if you keep pushing the buttons, like you'll end up with those bits that I was talking about earlier, right? And you'll go, that phrase down there isn't bad. And that idea wasn't horrible. Right. And then you can query it. Why don't I like it? What is wrong with it? Why isn't it delivering? To me, it's really a lot of failure is what is required. And so that idea that what you're typing should be ready in any way is what keeps the sheet blank. I think you should just get underway, like you said earlier. Just start getting ideas on the page and don't worry about the format.
I love that point you said about keep typing, because that could be really helpful too. Take 5 minutes, take 10 minutes and do like a creative sprint. This can be really, really helpful if you're trying to think of like a title for something or maybe an opening sentence. Type whatever comes into your head. There is no bad idea. There is no stupid idea. Just, set a timer for 5 or 10 minutes and just anything that pops into your head, type it onto the screen. You can go back later and weed out the stupid stuff, but just putting it all out there will get you in a mindset of more creativity and allowing any thought to just appear on that page, even if it's only for a minute or two, will really, really help you get going.
Right. There is a concept where you need a certain amount of tension in order to actually start moving on any deliverable. If you have a lot of time to write something, most people will procrastinate and not get started. And equally, if you have too short a time, you're under too much pressure and you're putting yourself under that pressure, this thing absolutely has to be perfect. That can crush your creativity. So you need to find and sometimes artificially create that level of tension so that you start. So I will often think, right, I'm going to write this press release and I'm going to give myself half an hour to do this, to get the first cut of it done or the back of this and go. It could be a blog post or whatever it is, right? And you shut off everything else and you just get something down so that you're underway, and you can come back to it later. You can spend more time on it, but artificially creating that right level of tension so that you've started is really critical. And so sort of related, I'm a big fan of the sort of quick and dirty first draft. Get it down, get your thoughts on the page. You can move them around. You can reorder them. You can research extra stuff. You can refine, you can edit it. But going back to that post about funding, that's 5,000 words that, I just sat down and just banged straight out. And once you get going, most of it's done. I didn't do it all in one session, but you're underway. And so I'm a big fan of that sort of quick and dirty first draft. Do you guys agree, or are you a bit more formal?
No, I 100% agree with that. 100%. And just quickly on that funding announcement blog post, it is long, folks. If you haven't read it, though, it is fantastic. It does not feel like it's 5,000 words. Like, I read it and was like, Morgan was in the zone when he wrote this. Like, I could just picture you just typing away. And it didn't feel that long because someone was like, oh, God, that's a beast. And it's long, but it was ridiculously helpful. And there weren't any parts that lingered off. So props to you, Morgan, for that. But yeah, no, I totally agree. The quick and dirty, just get it out there. Just get something on the paper, anything. It doesn't matter. And if it's terrible, no one knows but you. You go back and fix it later.
So that comes on to the next important point, which is editing. And I find it hard to edit my own work, which is I've done the quick and dirty first pass. Then I'll go through and I'll format it and, make it look good. I'll correct all the errors and the grammar, etc. But then you need to go through and go, okay, sentence by sentence, how could I say this better? And does this sentence, is this sentence working? And is it succinct? Does it link to the next one? Is this paragraph working? What can I cut out? I'm great at cutting stuff out, but I find editing my own work or rephrasing things using the mot juste a little bit harder. I need somebody else to help me with that. And equally, when I'm editing somebody else's, I'm in there with a red pen, cutting stuff down and rephrasing it. I have no issues with that.
My wife is an editor. That's what she does for a living. And you appreciate that. You think you understand that. And then I had to write something pretty important. And I had a word count that I had to get under. And I couldn't do it. I liked all of my ideas. I didn't want to eliminate any of them. And I couldn't figure it out. And so finally I asked her to take a look at it. And first of all, she hoovered it up more than I thought I could, right? Meaning extra words that weren't necessary. She found better phrases for. Then she struck a couple ideas. And I was like, well, I like those ideas. And she's like, I don't know that your readers will. It's sort of in the weeds. So it's good to have a person who hasn't just sort of spent all this time falling in love with their research and their words and their ideas and finally found the hook for the piece and all that. It's good to have somebody who doesn't have truly any ownership of it. Just go in there and go, doesn't that sound better? But I've definitely been edited and been like, I like my version better. So, but you need it.
And I think the key is don't panic because yes, a second set of eyeballs is worth its weight in gold. But if you don't have that, that's okay too. There are a couple of things that you can do. And one thing that I always do, whether someone else is going to read it or not, is let it sit for a while and go back to it. Ideally, that's overnight. So if you're a procrastinator and the thing's due on Tuesday, plan to get it done on Monday so that first thing Tuesday morning, you can go look at it. So that's huge because you will get so into the weeds just staring at it that you won't see any issues. You won't see any mistakes. If you don't have time for that, even just a couple of hours, one thing that you can do is to read it out loud. Because if it's really wordy or something's really awkward, you're going to hear that when you read it out loud. Your eyes may just instinctively kind of glaze over it because you've been staring at it for so long. But if you physically have to say it, you will notice it. And it's almost like someone else is reading it to you. It's just almost like a second set of eyes. And you'll notice the parts that are too wordy or maybe a little awkward or anything like that. Second set of eyeballs is great, but definitely not mandatory.
I would add to that people, when they edit their own work, tend to have the recency of whatever they just finished, blinding them. I just wrote these last 2 paragraphs, and the first 3 paragraphs they've read 50 times. You're probably not going to necessarily find as many errors there as in the middle that you don't get to as much, right? Because you're like, yeah, yada, yada, yada. All right, this looks good. Let's get back down to the place where I'm working on this story or content piece. I couldn't agree more with what Nicole said. Just stepping away. The more time you have away from it, the more you'll want to edit it. I can look back at my college writing and go, gosh, I could use another edit now. So yeah, the more time that there is there, the more you, I think.
Right. And related here is you got to sort of check your ego when someone else is editing it. And of course, if you have your wife doing it, that's one thing. But, your colleagues are going to edit it. And in an agency, this is very common, and you very quickly lose your ego over what you've written, and the best ideas win. But I know that if that's not normally the sort of work product and you're not normally writing, and others are in there sort of changing your voice a little bit, and some of your arguments, it's natural to feel a bit defensive about he's trying to get the best outcome here. Sometimes it's okay to sort of go in and fight for, hey, this is an argument and I really think we should make it, or you made this more boring. And that's okay. But it can't come from a place of ego, because we're all trying to get this done. And sort of related to this point about editing, I think editing by committee, this happens all the time with press releases, for example, but at plenty of other deliverables too, can just sort of corporate blandification of content, because it just becomes the lowest common denominator. And there's always someone, I don't know, I don't agree with this argument, I don't like this word, right? And it just becomes worse. So I would have as few people editing it as required. But related to this, how do you sort of keep some voice and pace and character in your writing? You got to get people to read it.
Yeah, you absolutely have to get people to read it. And I think part of that is you have to be conversational. You're not writing a book report for school anymore. This doesn't have to be 2 pages, single spaced. Like, just pretend like you're sitting down to lunch with a friend and explain this to them, or make your argument to them, or whatever that is. But it has to be human. I think especially now with AI, I think we've gotten very, very good at distinguishing what is truly human. And does it always adhere perfectly to grammar? Not necessarily. Does it always adhere perfectly to like the sentence structure you learned in the 7th grade? No, but that's okay, because that's not how we talk. And when I write something, I want someone to read it as if I'm just telling it to them, like, hey, did you know this? Or, hey, have you seen this? Something like that. And to your point about too many cooks coming into the kitchen, that is just, it's a nightmare. And it's usually a conversation that we'll have with clients is like, look, who's the final decision maker on this? Because we have 12 people in this document and they all have opinions. And first off, which one of you is my final stakeholder? Like, that's a good question to know. And I don't mind pushing back when they say, well, I want to take this out. If it's something that I think is worth falling on the sword over, I'll tell them. That's part of our job is to consult them, not just to write stuff for them to mark up, but to say, no, I really recommend leaving this in, because there's a lot of give and take there.
A lot of the writing that I tend to do, I'm writing under someone's byline in particular, for example. And then I'm really trying to just capture what would they say? How would they say it? Like, what's their voice? And that's a lot easier than writing for a brand at large, like website copy or things like that. And we've done blog posts about how to kind of zero in on that. And we've talked a little bit about the different types of companies and how to write for different kinds of brands. But there has to be that defined at the start of writing, right? Like, not every brand or sale is casual, right? Even though you would want to be able to lean that direction. There are folks that want to hear that you live in their world. They want to hear the specific industry buzzwords, or they want to hear you talk casually or complain about the things that they would, right? So there is a little bit of what character am I as I'm writing this piece that I think you have to bring in. And it's easy when you have, you're writing for a particular spokesperson or so on and so forth. But if I'm thinking about what if I'm writing copy that's intended to be gated, things like that, I'm kind of thinking about maybe I'll watch some videos and see how they sell, right? And the tone that the sales folks use as they approach this. So I'm really trying to find some human to base my voice on.
I think it's funny that you mentioned the bylines and that's like, it comes easy to you. And I admire your ability to do that, because for me, that is the hardest type of writing, is to sit down and write a byline for somebody. Even if you know the person and you know kind of how they communicate, how they talk, the points that they want to make, it's something I really struggle with when someone else's name, if it's a company at large or brand, like that's not as hard for some reason. But, to me, byline articles are truly a work of art, because you're literally trying to capture every word, every point, everything that this person would say themselves. It's a lot of pressure.
Oh, that's so interesting. Well, I mean, that's probably why we end up where we end up. To me, like writing for a brand archetype is a lot of research and it's a lot of responsibility. And then you do have a lot of people weighing in, where if I can just be like, hey, does this sound like something you would say, Joan? And she's like, yes, then you know what I mean? Like, I have someone who I can validate it with right away. I guess it just all depends on sort of where you're coming from when you're writing.
Yeah, you got to have the right vocabulary. You don't want to be writing for an older man, and when you read it, it sounds like a millennial woman because the vocabulary and the phrasing is wrong. They're never going to approve that. It's just not quite right. I do think it's important to have some sort of variety in pace and in sentence structure and length in the writing to kind of give it some interest and know the rules and then deliberately break them. It is infuriating when someone constantly like removes every split infinitive and makes every passive sentence active, because it just kills it. It just makes it the same and very predictable, and you're not getting any joy out of the writing in that. So yes, know the rules, but then break them deliberately, because that's what keeps it fresh. Now, Nicole, you mentioned AI and the topic of writing. You can't sort of cover it unless we talk about what role it plays. For instance, I love Grammarly at the moment. I think they've done a great job, just to catch different words. Hey, what different words might I use here? Sometimes it can help you rephrase things. Sometimes normally I reject its suggestions, but it'll catch all your punctuation errors and that kind of stuff. So I think it's quite kind of useful for those kind of things. But what role should AI play? Because we've seen so much Chat GPT sort of just chum when it comes to
every time I see something start with "in today's ever-changing landscape," I'm like, you got that from ChatGPT. And if I read it and someone actually wrote that, I go, that sounds like ChatGPT wrote it. We're changing this immediately. But yes, AI can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. I like to use it for smaller things. I would never say, go write this blog post, because it's never going to be able to do it. Or I would have to give it so many details and such a prompt that I'll just go write it. But a lot of times what I'll do is to come up with subject lines for emails, or to come up with titles for a blog post. And I'll say, okay, here's who you are. Here's what you're an expert in. Here's what you're trying to accomplish. Here's who you're talking to. And I need 5 really concise, attention-grabbing titles for this blog post. And you paste it in there. Or you say, I need 5 subject lines for this email, and here's what you're trying to do with it. And it'll often give me some angles that I didn't think of. In terms of AI, I use it for short stuff. I use it for titles for blog posts. I use it for subject lines for emails, because you're just in this zone when you're writing, and it can give you some options or just another way of phrasing something or a different angle that you may not have thought of yourself. I'm not going to take what ChatGPT spits out and use it verbatim. But if I go, hey, I hadn't really thought of attacking it from that angle, that's like actually a really good point. I could usually come up with something myself. So in that regard, It's absolutely valuable. If you think it's going to be a shortcut to getting your book report done, it's not.
I tend to use AI with my research for summarizations to kind of get some of those parts that I'm talking about when I'm in that ideation stage, right? Like we start with a new client, you have a fulsome kickoff, but you can't get across like all the things they could possibly talk about. But let's say they have a healthy blog that they've had going for a couple of years, right? Like ChatGPT is pretty good, especially the latest version. You give it a precise URL and you say, okay, summarize the topics that were discussed here. And then suddenly I have, okay, now here's the 15 things that this company has talked about, or maybe a name of a couple customers or things like that now I can kind of use to come up with my angle, my idea, some examples to illustrate the point. So I'll use it for that. I'll definitely use it to go reduce this to 42 words because I need to get under a word count. Those kinds of tasks. I just don't think it's very good at creating the kind of prose that Morgan was talking about that doesn't necessarily conform to all the rules, right? Where you got to throw an ain't in there sometimes. You got to throw with that sucks sometimes. You got to break with the flow, and ChatGPT does not know how to do that very well at all. It's sort of like the straightest version of the information possible. And that's good when you don't want to read a lot.
I want to just touch on some common pitfalls in people's writing, signs that we can all look out for to improve our own writing. Ian, what do you see?
I'm going to put aside all the things that you were supposed to learn before you took the SAT, right? Like where to put the apostrophes. Yeah. And you see this persist in professional copy constantly. But I think the most common pitfalls are sort of following the form to a fault, still gets super boring. Assuming that the audience has just done all the research that you just did. Assuming they understand context, that could be a problem. And I'd say overall, thinking that more formal, longer words, longer sentences, longer pieces equals better writing. In almost every case, the fewer words you can use, the better.
100%. I think that's a huge mistake people make. They're way too wordy. And Morgan, I'm probably one of those people that changes all of your passive sentences to active, but people are usually too wordy. There's just words in there that you don't need. And there's a lot of opportunity to cut them out. I think one thing that people don't do enough of though, is using adjectives, because adjectives, they just add emotion. Like it just can really convey a feeling or a reaction or something. It just makes it more clear to the reader of how they should be feeling and how they should be consuming this content. So I'm always taking out extra words, adding in adjectives. And then I think in our line of business, since we work with tech startups, one of the biggest mistakes I see is they think because they're writing about tech, it has to be dry or it can't be fun or it can't be interesting. There can't be life to it. And it's so ironic because we'll talk to people and they're so invigorated by what their product can do or what their mission is or why their company was founded. They're so excited about that. And then they'll write something that is just boring. And it's like, you're not doing yourself or your product or your company justice. Maybe it's a boring product. I don't know, but maybe it doesn't wow as much as you might think, or maybe it's just very nitty gritty technical that you think you just have to go and talk like you're a developer. Go be a human, go be excited about it and let that show in your writing. So, anything can be lively and interesting and you can use humor too.
Yeah, I have two main tips about becoming a better writer when it comes to the tech space. And the first one is to read a lot about tech. Build your domain expertise about cybersecurity or fintech, not just about the company that you're working with, but more broadly, so that you're familiar with the vocabulary and the concepts and the technology and the history of that area, so that whatever you write is framed within sort of context. When I'm writing about a new client, it takes me some time to kind of, they have their own vocabulary, their own words of art, and I have to get comfortable with typing those phrases in and how they fit together. But, you need to build that and have that and come to it. The best writers have real domain expertise there so that they're fluent. They're not learning the concept whilst they're writing it. They already know the concepts. And then my next one is that you'll become a better writer by writing. And you've just got to write a lot. Early in my career, my agency, we would just come in and we would spend an hour writing every morning or half an hour, just crank out this press release, crank out this post. This was before blog post, but write this article. So just writing a lot. And I found when I started my own blog, you're just writing a lot, thousands of words a day. And that just gives you a lot more confidence. And to your point about at the beginning, you're a bit wordy. People come out of school thinking that the longest word possible and the longest sentence is the best because, hey, look at my vocabulary. And actually, in business, the shortest sentence with the simplest words is the best. And it takes some time to unlearn that practice. And how do you unlearn it? Well, I can tell you, but you have to do it. You have to just keep writing and writing and writing and writing and writing. Doesn't matter what you're writing about. Just keep grinding stuff out. And if you want to get better at this, you're just going to have to type away. Do you have any other tips just before we close on this that people should bear in mind when they're copywriting?
Morgan, to your point about trying to be fancy in the biggest word possible, I think some of the best advice I can give is all those fancy words you learned for the SAT that you had on note cards or whatever, chuck them, get rid of them. No one cares, right? As if, somebody may be half paying attention, because as much as we would love for somebody to read every single word that you have churned out, they're not going to. So make it easy to understand whatever you do. Don't use too fancy language because people don't like to feel dumb. If they don't understand the words that you're using, they're going to feel dumb and they're going to stop reading. So all the fancy words, they've got to go.
Our field allows us a unique chance to write all types of different kinds of pieces, formats, voices. It's underrated in that regard. If you're trying to become a good writer, it's a good job to have because you can learn how to write one type of thing over and over and over, right? But here in this field, you really have to polish every part of the instrument. So that's what I would say is embrace the 48 word speaker abstract. It teaches you how to write short. Embrace that tweet. Take on the dreaded white paper, laying out the difficult technical thing, because you build those muscles too and get the kind of experience that Morgan's talking about. Over the 20, 25 years I've been writing about tech, it's all seemed like trivia until it starts to take shape of, oh, wait, I understand this industry. I understand how this all relates, and it makes me better at writing that next 48 word speaking abstract.
I love that idea of staying sort of passionate and writing about different areas and writing different styles, because you might be great at byline articles, but you might find the technical stuff difficult. There's always another hill to climb or another skill to build there, which is great. And so thank you both for your time today. I hope everybody found that useful. And we certainly always checking each other's work and trying to refine the art of writing. There's a lot out there, but we thought it'd be useful for you to sort of see inside a little bit about our individual writing styles. And as you've seen, they're all slightly different. So whatever you do, make sure it's right for you. But good luck in your writing, and thanks for listening. We'll see you again next time. Ian, Nicole, thanks a lot.